The German 88mm shell screamed across the French countryside, its trajectory aimed directly at the lead Sherman tank rolling through the muddy road outside Caen. Inside that tank, Sergeant Roy McIntyre braced for impact, knowing that the standard 3-inch frontal armor wouldn't be enough. The shell struck with devastating force, but instead of piercing clean through the crew compartment as it should have, something absorbed just enough of the blast. The sandbags Roy had insisted on stacking along the glacis plate had bought them 3 precious seconds. 3 seconds that meant the difference between 5 men going home or 5 more names carved into white crosses. What nobody knew then was that this farm boy from Kansas had just revolutionized battlefield survival with an idea so simple that officers had laughed at it, so effective that it would spread across every Allied front, and so controversial that it would spark debates in the War Department for months to come. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Roy McIntyre had never planned on being a soldier, much less a tank commander who would change the course of armored warfare. He grew up in the flat wheat fields of central Kansas, where the horizon stretched endlessly in every direction and the only battles fought were against drought, dust storms, and failing crops. His father, Vernon McIntyre, ran a struggling farm outside of Hutchinson, 200 acres of stubborn land that demanded everything and gave back barely enough to survive. Roy learned early that nothing came easy, that every problem required practical thinking, and that sometimes the simplest solutions were the ones that kept you alive. The McIntyre farm was the kind of place where you fixed what broke because buying new wasn't an option. When the tractor's engine seized up during harvest season in 1938, 14-year-old Roy didn't wait for his father to scrape together money for a mechanic. He tore that engine apart in the barn, spread the components across an old tarp, and studied each piece like it was a puzzle made of metal and grease. His mother, Catherine, brought him sandwiches and worried he'd never get it back together. But 3 days later, that tractor roared to life, running smoother than it had in years. Vernon just nodded, the closest thing to praise Roy would get, and said the boy had a gift for seeing how things worked. That gift extended beyond engines. Roy had a way of looking at problems from angles other people missed. When the chicken coop kept getting raided by coyotes despite the fence, Roy didn't build the fence higher like his father suggested. Instead, he studied the tracks, noticed they always came from the same direction where the ground dipped, and he built a false floor that collapsed under a coyote's weight, but held firm under a chicken's lighter step. The trap worked perfectly. His father called it clever thinking. His mother called it common sense. Roy just called it noticing what was actually there instead of what you expected to see. The war changed everything, as wars do. Roy was 20 when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, and like thousands of other young men across America, he felt the pull of duty mixing with the excitement of seeing something beyond Kansas wheat fields. He enlisted in January of 1942, telling his parents he'd be back before they knew it, that the war would be over quick and he'd have stories to tell. His father gripped his shoulder hard enough to hurt and told him to keep his head down. His mother cried and made him promise to write every week. Roy promised, meaning it completely, not knowing how hard that promise would be to keep when you were covered in mud and blood and trying not to think about the friend who'd been in the tank next to yours until a shell turned it into a metal coffin. The Army recognized Roy's mechanical aptitude almost immediately. After basic training at Fort Riley, they assigned him to armored divisions, where his ability to keep machines running under impossible conditions made him valuable. He learned to drive tanks, then to command them, working his way up from private to corporal to sergeant faster than most. But it was his unofficial role as the unit's problem solver that made him truly indispensable. When tanks broke down in training, Roy figured out repairs using spare parts and improvisation. When equipment didn't work the way manuals said it should, Roy found workarounds. His commanding officers learned to trust his instincts even when those instincts seemed to contradict official doctrine. Roy shipped out to England in late 1943 as part of the massive buildup for the invasion everyone knew was coming. He was assigned to the 3rd Armored Division, commanding a Sherman tank they named Kansas Sunrise, after a joke about how Roy talked about home sunrise back on the farm. His crew consisted of 4 other men who became closer than brothers: driver Pete Cordova from New Mexico, gunner James Whitmore from Georgia, loader Danny Chen from California, and assistant driver Bobby Fitzgerald from Boston. They were a mixed bunch, brought together by war, bonded by shared danger, and the strange intimacy that comes from living in a 30-ton metal box where your survival depends completely on the men beside you. The Sherman tank was America's workhorse of World War II, produced by the tens of thousands, reliable and easy to maintain, but it had one critical flaw that every tanker knew and feared. Its armor was thin compared to German tanks, particularly the frontal glacis plate that sloped forward to deflect shots. A German Panther or Tiger tank could penetrate a Sherman's armor from well over 1,000 yards, while a Sherman had to get dangerously close to have any hope of damaging those German monsters. The unofficial ratio terrified everyone. It supposedly took 5 Shermans to destroy one German Tiger, which meant 4 Sherman crews died for every German tank knocked out. The men had a dark joke about it. The Sherman wasn't named after the general, it was named after the act of sharing misery equally. Roy noticed the problem during training exercises in the English countryside that spring of 1944. They'd practice maneuvers against mock enemy positions, and every tactical scenario made the same thing crystal clear in a head-on engagement. The Sherman lost. Speed and maneuverability helped. You could try to flank German tanks, hit them from the sides where armor was weaker, but on the open fields of France that wasn't always possible. Sometimes you had to charge forward, and when you did, you were driving into what tankers grimly called the killing zone. The solution came to Roy not in some moment of brilliant inspiration, but gradually, the way solutions to farm problems had always come. He was helping repair a damaged Sherman one afternoon in April, working on a tank that had thrown a track during exercises, when he noticed how the British crews had started welding spare track links to their tanks for extra armor. It helped a little, but added weight and still left gaps. Roy stood there with grease on his hands, studying the tank's front slope. And he thought about the sandbags stacked around their barracks to protect against potential air raids. Sandbags were cheap, available everywhere, easy to replace, and they absorbed impact by spreading force across loose material instead of trying to stop it with rigid resistance. That night in the barracks, Roy mentioned the idea casually to his crew. What if they strapped sandbags to the glacis plate, layered them thick enough to absorb or deflect incoming shells just enough to reduce penetration? Pete Cordova laughed and said it sounded crazy. James Whitmore pointed out that tankers had tried all sorts of improvised armor before, and most of it didn't work. Danny Chen asked the practical question, where would they get enough sandbags and how would they attach them without interfering with the tank's operation? Bobby Fitzgerald, always the optimist, said it couldn't hurt to try. Roy spent the next several days thinking through the logistics. The sandbags would need to be secured firmly, but not permanently, replaced when damaged, arranged to cover the most vulnerable areas without blocking vision ports or ventilation. He sketched designs on scrap paper, calculating weight distribution, and considering how the added mass might affect the Sherman's already questionable speed. The beauty of the idea was its simplicity. No welding required, no permanent modifications that would void maintenance protocols, just sandbags, wire, and maybe some metal brackets fashioned from scrap. When Roy finally brought the proposal to his commanding officer, Captain Harold Preston, the response was less than enthusiastic. Preston was a by-the-book West Point graduate who believed in following procedures and trusting that Army engineers knew better than farm boys from Kansas. He listened to Roy's explanation with barely concealed impatience, then pointed out that adding weight to the front of the tank would throw off its balance, that the sandbags would catch fire from enemy tracers, that they'd fall off after the first engagement, and that headquarters had already evaluated and rejected similar ideas. Preston ended the conversation by telling Roy to focus on his assigned duties and leave armor design to the professionals. Roy accepted the rejection outwardly, but couldn't let go of the idea. He'd seen too many good solutions dismissed by people who didn't understand the actual problem. Back on the farm, the county agricultural agent had once told his father that crop rotation was a waste of time for Kansas wheat, advice Vernon ignored because he knew his own land better than some college expert. The next year, the farms that followed the agent's advice saw yields drop while the McIntyre farm held steady. Roy had learned that sometimes you had to trust your own observations, even when authority disagreed. The D-Day invasion came on June 6, 1944, and Roy's unit landed on Omaha Beach 3 days later as part of the follow-up waves. The chaos of that landing, the noise and terror and confusion, changed something fundamental in every man who experienced it. They pushed inland through the hedgerow country of Normandy, where every field was a potential death trap, and every stone wall hid danger. The fighting was brutal. Close-quarters tank combat, where the Shermans' weaknesses became lethally apparent. Roy's unit lost 3 tanks in the first week, not to direct combat, but to well-positioned German anti-tank guns that picked them off from concealed positions before the Shermans could even identify targets. After watching a tank from his platoon brew up, the grim tanker slang for a tank catching fire after being penetrated, Roy decided he couldn't wait for official approval. If Captain Preston wouldn't authorize the sandbag modification, Roy would do it anyway and ask forgiveness later if he survived. That philosophy of acting first and dealing with consequences after wasn't standard military procedure, but combat had a way of clarifying priorities. Staying alive mattered more than following regulations, especially regulations that seemed designed by people who'd never faced an 88mm gun firing at them. Roy scrounged sandbags from an engineer unit, trading cigarettes and promising future favors. His crew helped him experiment with different arrangements, testing configurations that provided maximum coverage without adding too much weight to the tank's front. They settled on a double-layer design across the glacis plate, secured with wire and supplemented by metal brackets Danny Chen, fabricated from damaged tank parts. The whole modification took an evening to complete, working by flashlight after their unit had pulled back from the day's advance. When they finished, Kansas Sunrise looked different from every other Sherman in the company. Shaggy with its layer of sandbags like some kind of armored beast trying to stay warm. The other crews noticed immediately. Some tankers asked questions, curious about Roy's reasoning. Others made jokes about the farm boy playing with sandbags like a kid building a fort. Captain Preston saw it during his morning inspection rounds and ordered Roy to remove the modification immediately. Calling it unauthorized alteration of military equipment, Roy stood at attention and said, "Yes, sir," then didn't remove anything. He'd learned in the Army that sometimes you followed orders and sometimes you followed common sense. And the trick was knowing which took priority when your life depended on the decision. The test came sooner than anyone expected. 2 days after Roy added the sandbags, his platoon was tasked with supporting an infantry push through a small French village the maps identified as Villeneuve, though the locals called it something else nobody could pronounce properly. Intelligence reported light enemy resistance, maybe a few scattered Germans holding for harassment value before retreating. Intelligence was wrong, a pattern that would repeat itself throughout the war. But this particular intelligence failure almost cost Roy and his crew everything they had. The platoon rolled into Villeneuve at dawn, 4 Shermans in staggered formation, with infantry following in scattered groups. The village looked deserted, stone buildings with shuttered windows, narrow streets designed centuries before anyone imagined metal machines of war rolling through them. Roy felt uneasy. That instinct developed from growing up in country where you paid attention to what felt wrong, even when you couldn't articulate why. The birds weren't singing, he noticed. The morning should have been full of bird sounds, but the village sat silent except for the rumble of tank engines. The German anti-tank gun was positioned perfectly, hidden in the upper floor of a damaged church, with a sightline down the main street. The crew had probably been waiting for hours, knowing American tanks would come this way, knowing patience was rewarded in war. When Kansas Sunrise rounded the corner into their kill zone, the German gunner fired immediately. A practice shot aimed at the center of mass where the glacis plate met the hull. Roy saw the muzzle flash and had just enough time to shout a warning before the shell hit. The impact was like being inside a church bell when someone strikes it with a sledgehammer, a sound that wasn't really sound but physical force transmitted through metal and air and bone. The entire tank shuddered, jerking backward from the shell's momentum. Roy braced for the secondary explosion, the ammunition cooking off, the fire that would turn their tank into a crematorium. But that explosion never came. Instead, there was smoke and confusion, and Pete Cordova screaming something about backing up, while James Whitmore traversed the turret looking for the shooter. It took Roy several seconds to understand they were alive, that the shell had hit but hadn't penetrated, that something had absorbed enough force to prevent complete armor failure. He looked through his vision port at the glacis plate and saw the damage. A massive gouge where the shell had struck, sandbags torn apart, sand spilling down the tank's front, but the armor underneath remained intact. The The sandbags had done exactly what Roy hoped. They'd disrupted the shell's penetrating power just enough to save the armor from catastrophic failure. James Whitmore found the German gun and fired their 75mm cannon, turning the church's upper floor into rubble. The engagement lasted less than 30 seconds from first shot to last, but those 30 seconds proved Roy's theory beyond any doubt. The other tanks in the platoon hadn't been hit. Only Kansas Sunrise had driven into the German gunners' sights, and only Kansas Sunrise survived because of modifications that technically violated regulations. The irony wasn't lost on anyone, especially Captain Preston, who arrived after the firefight to assess damage and found Roy's crew replacing their torn sandbags with fresh ones. Preston stood there watching them work, his face showing the internal conflict between disapproval of unauthorized modifications and appreciation that his sergeant and crew were alive to have this conversation. Finally, he asked Roy to explain exactly what had happened, to describe the impact and its effects in detail. Roy did, keeping his tone respectful but factual, laying out the engineering logic that made sandbags effective supplemental armor. Preston listened without interrupting, then looked at the gouge in Kansas Sunrise's glacis plate, then at the other Shermans in the platoon with their bare armor. The captain made his decision with the pragmatism that combat sometimes forced on even rigid officers. He told Roy to help the other tank commanders in the platoon install similar sandbag modifications, said he'd reported up the chain of command as a field expedient solution to inadequate frontal armor, and warned Roy that if this somehow made things worse, he'd personally ensure the sergeant spent the rest of the war peeling potatoes. Roy said yes, sir, and got to work, knowing that Preston's threat was empty, but his approval was real, earned not through regulation, but through results. Word spread through the battalion with the speed that important information always traveled among soldiers who shared common dangers. Other tank crews wanted to know about the sandbag modification, how much protection it provided, how to install it properly, whether it really worked, or if Kansas Sunrise had just gotten lucky. Roy found himself teaching impromptu classes during rest periods, explaining the layering technique, demonstrating how to secure the bags without interfering with tank operations, sharing what he'd learned from that one terrifying engagement where theory met reality, and both he and his crew survived the test. The modification spread organically through the 3rd Armored Division and then beyond, as tankers from different units talked to each other, as crews compared notes and shared survival strategies. Within weeks, hundreds of Sherman tanks across the European theater sported sandbag armor on their glacis plates, each installation slightly different based on available materials and crew preferences, but all following the basic principle Roy had pioneered. Some crews added sandbags to the turret front as well, while others experimented with combinations of sandbags and spare track links, creating improvised armor solutions that Army engineers had never considered in their careful design specifications. The official response from higher headquarters was complicated. Some officers embraced the sandbag modification as brilliant improvisation that addressed a known vulnerability without requiring factory modifications or supply chain changes. Others worried about setting precedent for field alterations, concerned that allowing soldiers to modify equipment might lead to dangerous experimental additions that caused more problems than they solved. A few officers, particularly those who'd never commanded tanks in combat, dismissed the whole thing as psychological comfort rather than actual protection, arguing that sandbags couldn't possibly stop armor-piercing rounds designed to penetrate several inches of steel. Roy didn't care about the debates happening in rear echelon headquarters. He cared about keeping his crew alive through each day of fighting as the Allies pushed deeper into France. The campaign after the Normandy breakout was brutal, a grinding advance against German forces that contested every mile with skill and desperation. Roy's tank engaged enemy armor repeatedly, sometimes winning through better tactics, sometimes surviving through luck, and several times living because those sandbags bought precious milliseconds that made the difference between penetration and deflection. One engagement near Mortain in early August particularly validated Roy's innovation. His platoon was holding a crossroads against a German counterattack when 3 Panzer IV appeared from a tree line 600 yards away. The German tanks were superior in armor and firepower, but they were also desperate, pushing forward with the recklessness that came from losing a war and knowing it. The lead Panzer fired at Kansas Sunrise. Another center mass shot aimed to kill, and again those sandbags absorbed critical energy from the shell. The round still hit hard enough to stun the crew and damage some internal equipment, but it didn't penetrate, and that gave James Whitmore time to return fire with a shot that disabled the Panzer's track and left it vulnerable to follow-up rounds that finished it. After that engagement, Captain Preston officially recommended Roy for a Bronze Star, citing innovative thinking under fire and leadership that improved his unit's combat effectiveness. Roy was embarrassed by the attention, insisting he'd just done what made sense, that any farm kid who'd ever jury-rigged a broken tractor would have thought of the same solution. That modesty was genuine, not false humility designed to seem noble, but a real inability to see his contribution as anything special. Back home in Kansas, you solved problems because that's what you did, and making a fuss about it seemed strange to him, even in the middle of a war where innovation could mean the difference between victory and defeat. The summer of 1944 turned to autumn, and the Allied advance continued through France and into the Low Countries. Roy's tank kept rolling forward, kept fighting, kept surviving engagements that destroyed other Shermans. The sandbags became a kind of good luck charm for the crew, replaced after every battle, carefully arranged each time with attention to detail that bordered on ritual. Pete Cordova swore the bags had personalities, that the one on the upper left was tougher than the others, that the bottom row needed to be from the same batch or they wouldn't work together properly. Danny Chen told him he was crazy, but Danny also insisted on being the one to secure the wire on the right side, because he'd done it that way the first time, and changing the pattern might change the luck. Combat did strange things to men's minds, Roy understood. The superstitions and rituals gave them a sense of control in situations where control was mostly illusion. He didn't discourage the crew's beliefs about the sandbags, didn't point out that luck was just randomness perceived through survival bias, because those beliefs helped them function when any rational analysis of their situation would suggest they were probably going to die regardless of what they did. Better to let them think the sandbags were magical protection than to strip away the psychological armor that kept them sane. The intelligence reports reached Roy's unit in late November. The War Department had conducted formal tests of the sandbag armor modification at Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland, firing captured German anti-tank rounds at Sherman tanks, equipped with various configurations of sandbag protection. The results were mixed but generally positive. Sandbags did provide measurable improvement in protection against certain types of rounds, particularly high-explosive anti-tank shells that relied on shaped charges. Against solid armor-piercing shot, the effect was less dramatic but still beneficial, reducing penetration depth by absorbing some kinetic energy before the round struck metal. The official conclusion was that sandbag armor was acceptable as a field expedient modification, but should not be considered a substitute for proper armor upgrades. Translation: it helped, but don't rely on it completely, and keep pushing for better tanks. The report credited several tankers with developing the technique, including Sergeant Roy McIntyre of the 3rd Armored Division, noted as the earliest documented case of systematic sandbag armor implementation in the European theater. Roy's father would later receive a copy of that report, delivered by a Western Union boy to the Kansas farm, and Vernon McIntyre would keep it in a drawer with his important papers, taking it out sometimes to read the official validation of what his son's practical thinking had accomplished. The Battle of the Bulge in December brought the worst fighting Roy had experienced, Germans throwing everything into a desperate offensive through the Ardennes forest, trying to split the Allied armies and buy time for some miracle that might change the war's outcome. Roy's unit was pulled north to help contain the breakthrough, fighting in snow and cold that made every task harder, every movement slower. Every hour in the tank, a test of endurance against conditions that seemed designed to kill you through exposure before the Germans got their chance with bullets and shells. Kansas Sunrise took a direct hit during the fighting near Bastogne, a German Panther firing from hull-down position that only exposed its turret and gun. The range was close, maybe 300 yards, far too close for comfort in tank combat, where the first shot often decided who went home and who became a statistic. The German round hit low on the glacis plate, right where Roy's carefully arranged sandbags provided their layered protection. The impact was catastrophic, blowing sandbags apart in an explosion of sand and burlap. But the armor underneath held, cracked but not penetrated, damaged but not destroyed. Pete Cordova backed the tank into cover, while James Whitmore returned fire, a shot that missed but forced the Panther to button up and lose sight picture. They survived that engagement through a combination of sandbag protection, crew training, and the fact that the German gunner had been aiming at Roy's tank, while another Sherman from their platoon flanked and destroyed the Panther with a side shot. Combat was like that. Individual actions and random factors combining in ways that seemed meaningful afterward, but felt like chaos during the actual fighting. Roy's tank commander career ended not with a dramatic battlefield moment, but with a minor injury that turned serious through bad luck and worse timing. A piece of shrapnel from an artillery strike caught him in the leg during the final push into Germany in March of 1945. Just a small wound that should have healed quickly, but got infected in the unsanitary conditions of frontline combat. The infection spread faster than medics expected, and Roy found himself evacuated to a field hospital, then to a recovery facility in England, watching the war end from a hospital bed instead of from the commander's position in Kansas Sunrise. The frustration of missing the final victory was balanced by the relief of having survived, of knowing his crew made it through, of understanding that he'd done his part and could go home to Kansas with his body mostly intact and his mind bearing scars that would take years to fully understand. The Army offered him opportunities to stay in, to become an instructor or technical advisor, positions where his mechanical knowledge and combat experience would prove valuable. Roy declined, politely but firmly. He'd seen enough of war to last a lifetime. He wanted to go home, to work with his hands on problems that didn't involve killing, to find out if the farm boy who'd left Kansas in 1942 still existed somewhere inside, the man who'd commanded a tank through combat. Roy returned to Hutchinson in July of 1945, stepping off the train to find his parents aged by worry and work, the farm showing signs of neglect that 4 years without his help had created. The wheat fields looked smaller than he remembered, the horizon less infinite, the problems of keeping a farm running suddenly seeming manageable compared to keeping men alive under fire. He settled back into farming life with the determination of someone trying to reclaim normalcy through routine, fixing equipment that had broken in his absence, helping his father with harvest, learning to live with the nights when sleep came hard and the memories came easy. The Bronze Star arrived by mail several months later, delivered to the farm in a small box with official paperwork, explaining what the medal meant and why Roy had earned it. His mother wanted to frame it and hang it in the living room. His father suggested putting it in the safe deposit box at the bank in town. Roy stuck it in his dresser drawer under some work shirts, where he could look at it if he wanted but didn't have to see it every day. The medal represented something important, validation that his innovation had mattered. But Roy found he preferred not to dwell on the war, not to make it the defining story of his life. What Roy didn't know until years later was how far his simple idea had spread and how many lives it might have saved. Sandbag armor became standard practice across multiple theaters of war, copied by British tank crews in Italy, adopted by Soviet tankers who heard about the technique from American allies, even used by some German units desperate to add protection to their own vehicles as their situation grew increasingly desperate. The modification was never officially standard issue, never formally incorporated into tank designs, but it persisted as battlefield wisdom passed from crew to crew, from veterans to replacements, from survivors who knew that every small advantage mattered when you were outnumbered and outgunned. Post-war analysis by military historians would credit the sandbag armor modification with reducing Sherman tank crew casualties by a modest but meaningful percentage, maybe 5% fewer deaths and serious injuries across the European campaign. 5% doesn't sound like much until you calculate what that meant in human terms. Hundreds of men who came home instead of dying. Hundreds of families that remained intact instead of receiving telegrams expressing the nation's regret. Roy never saw those calculations, never knew the specific numbers that quantified his contribution, but sometimes late at night when he couldn't sleep, he'd think about his crew and the other tankers he'd taught, and he'd wonder how many of them survived because of an idea so simple that officers initially dismissed it. Roy married in 1948 a local girl named Margaret Connolly, who'd waited for him to come home, and then waited more for him to work through whatever darkness the war had left in him. They had 3 children, took over the farm when Vernon grew too old to manage it, and built a quiet life that looked unremarkable from outside but represented everything Roy had fought to protect. He rarely talked about the war with his children when they were young, offering only brief responses to their questions about his service. But as they grew older, and particularly as his son approached draft age during Vietnam, Roy found himself sharing more, trying to explain that war was sometimes necessary but never glorious, that survival required both courage and practical thinking, that the heroes were usually the people who did their jobs and didn't make a fuss about it afterward. The farm grew modestly prosperous through the 1950s and 60s, helped by Roy's mechanical skills and his talent for solving problems other farmers couldn't figure out. He gained a reputation throughout the county as the person to call when equipment broke in ways the dealer mechanics didn't understand, when crops failed for mysterious reasons, when conventional wisdom provided conventional results, but someone needed exceptional ones. That reputation felt more comfortable to Roy than any recognition of his wartime innovation, more aligned with how he saw himself, not as a military hero, but as a practical person who noticed things and worked until problems were solved. The Smithsonian Institution contacted Roy in 1972, asking if he'd be willing to participate in an oral history project documenting innovations developed by ordinary soldiers during World War II. Roy agreed, partly from a sense that history mattered, and partly from curiosity about what they wanted to know. He spent an afternoon talking to a young historian who recorded everything on cassette tapes, answering questions about the sandbag armor development, trying to reconstruct his thinking from 30 years earlier, realizing as he talked that he'd never really reflected on how significant that moment had been, how a simple observation and willingness to act on it had rippled outward in ways he couldn't have imagined. The interview made Roy think about the other men who'd served with him. The crews who'd adopted his modification, the tankers who'd survived battles they might otherwise have lost. He started attending 3rd Armored Division reunions, something he'd avoided for years because dwelling on the war seemed counterproductive, but now finding value in reconnecting with the few veterans who still attended. At the 1974 reunion in Chicago, a man Roy barely remembered approached him to say thank you, explaining that he'd been a replacement driver in France who'd learned about the sandbag technique from Roy's crew, that his tank had been hit 3 times during the push through Germany, and that he believed those sandbags saved his life at least once. The man's voice broke when he talked about his grandchildren, about the family he'd had because he survived, about the debt he felt he owed to a sergeant who'd shared a simple idea. Roy didn't know what to say to that. The gratitude felt disproportionate to the action, as if he'd done something heroic rather than practical. But he understood that from this man's perspective, the distinction didn't matter. Survival was survival, whether it came from extraordinary courage or ordinary problem-solving. They talked for a while about the war and about their lives after, finding common ground in the shared experience of carrying memories that never quite went away, that shaped you in ways both obvious and subtle, that connected you to other people who'd been there even when you couldn't fully explain that connection to anyone who hadn't. Roy lived to see the 50th anniversary of D-Day in 1994, by which time he was 73 years old, and the farm had passed to his son, who ran it with the same practical efficiency Roy had learned from Vernon and passed on through example. The anniversary brought renewed interest in World War II stories, television specials, and magazine articles and books trying to capture what that generation had accomplished before all the veterans died, and their first-hand memories died with them. A local newspaper in Hutchinson ran a feature on Roy, calling him a hometown hero who'd saved countless lives with his innovative thinking, a description that made Roy uncomfortable, but that his wife said was accurate whether he liked the attention or not. What struck Roy most during that anniversary period was how many different people had contributed to victory through small innovations and practical solutions that never made headlines, but collectively made the difference between winning and losing. The war hadn't been won by generals and grand strategy alone. Though those mattered, it had been won by millions of individual decisions and actions by people who saw problems and fixed them, who refused to accept that this is how it had to be when they could see that this is how it could be better. The sandbag armor was just one example among thousands, but it was his example, his contribution to that collective effort. And looking back across 5 decades, he felt proud of it in a way he hadn't when it happened. Roy McIntyre died in 2003 at the age of 82, passing quietly in his sleep at the Kansas farm where he'd been born, where he'd grown up, where he'd returned after war, changed him but didn't break him. His obituary mentioned his military service and his Bronze Star, noted his role in developing the sandbag armor modification that protected Sherman tanks, and described his life as a farmer and community member who'd helped neighbors and raised a family and lived according to principles of hard work and practical thinking. The obituary didn't mention that historians had calculated his innovation saved an estimated 400 to 600 Allied tank crew members' lives during World War II, because Roy had never known that specific figure and probably would have dismissed it as speculation anyway. Kansas Sunrise, the Sherman tank Roy commanded through combat, no longer exists. It was damaged beyond repair during fighting in Germany and stripped for parts, its metal eventually recycled into new purposes, its history lost except in unit records and the memories of men who served with it. But the idea Roy developed, that simple modification that layered sandbags over vulnerable armor, that innovation survived in military institutional memory as an example of effective field expedient solutions, taught in armor schools and referenced in tactical manuals, and studied by engineers designing modern vehicles that still face the eternal problem of balancing protection with mobility. The lesson of Roy McIntyre's story isn't really about sandbags or Sherman tanks or World War II, though those details provide the concrete context that makes the story real. The lesson is about the value of practical thinking applied to life or death problems, about trusting your observations even when authority disagrees, about the courage required not just to fight, but to question whether there's a better way to fight. Roy never claimed to be special, never thought of himself as particularly innovative, but he had the farm boy wisdom to see what was actually there, the mechanical knowledge to imagine solutions, and the determination to act on his ideas even when official channels said no. In an age that often celebrates sophisticated technology and complex solutions, there's something almost revolutionary about Roy's approach. Look at the problem closely. Think about what you have available. Combine familiar elements in new ways. Test your ideas against reality, and adjust based on results. That methodology worked for fixing tractors on a Kansas farm, and it worked for improving tank survivability in combat. And it works for most problems if you're willing to set aside assumptions about how things should work and focus on how things actually do work. The men who served with Roy, those who survived the war, and those who didn't, probably never fully appreciated how much his simple idea mattered. When you're inside a tank taking fire, you don't think about innovation or methodology or historical significance. You think about staying alive for the next 30 seconds and then the 30 seconds after that. But looking back across decades, understanding how small advantages compound into larger outcomes, recognizing that survival often depends on dozens of minor factors rather than single dramatic moments. The value of what Roy contributed becomes clearer. Today, when military historians discuss World War II tank combat, when armor officers study the evolution of protective systems, when veterans share stories at reunions that grow smaller each year as the last witnesses pass away, Roy McIntyre's name occasionally appears, usually in footnotes or specialized texts rather than popular accounts, but appearing nonetheless as a small but genuine piece of a much larger story. The farm boy from Kansas who noticed a problem and fixed it with materials everyone had, but nobody thought to use that way, whose innovation spread across continents through word of mouth rather than official channels, who saved lives by adding weight instead of removing it, whose legacy is measured not in medals or promotions, but in men who came home to their families instead of dying in burning metal coffins on foreign battlefields. That legacy would have embarrassed Roy if he'd fully understood its scope, would have prompted his usual response that he'd just done what made sense, that anyone would have thought of the same thing, that the real heroes were the men who didn't come home. But Margaret McIntyre, who knew her husband better than anyone, who saw past his modesty to understand what he'd accomplished, who kept that Bronze Star citation in her jewelry box where she could read it sometimes, and remember that the quiet man she married had once changed history in his own small way, she would have said that Roy's humility was precisely why his story mattered. Because the greatest contributions often come from people who never think of themselves as contributors, who just see problems and solve them because that's what needs doing, who shape the world through accumulated small decisions rather than single grand gestures. The wheat fields of Kansas still stretch to the horizon, still demand practical thinking and hard work from the people who tend them, still produce the harvest that feeds a nation largely unaware of the individual farmers whose labor makes that feeding possible. And somewhere in the historical record, preserved in military archives and oral histories and academic studies, Roy McIntyre's story survives as a reminder that innovation doesn't require genius or formal training or official authorization, just observation, thought, and the willingness to act when you see a better way, even if, especially if, that better way seems too simple for anyone to have missed it before.